I do worry that AI might actually undermine the way we learn and our capacity to innovate. And so you and I, we write papers, books, articles, and we know that the only reason that we are able to have an informed conversation about these things is that we have written about them, and that has allowed us to structure our ideas. When students today use AI to write essays, they are missing out on the learning process.
Welcome to the new Enlightenment Podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Professor Carl Benedikt Frey, who is a professor of AI and work at Oxford University. He's also the director of the Future of Work program at the Oxford Martin School. He's got a new book out, which will in part be the topic of our conversation, How Progress Ends. Carl, welcome to the new Enlightenment.
Good to be with you, Adam.
So your new book, How Progress Ends. Are we at a moment where we have stopped progressing?
Well, we're certainly at a moment where productivity stagnation is very real. And it's not just a British story, it's not just a European story, it's also an American and a Chinese story. Productivity a slowdown is happening across the board. And I think we have to ask ourselves why that is. Why is it that the computer revolution, the internet, the personal computer that had so much promise did not live up to the expectations and did not repeat the productivity miracles of electricity and internal combustion engine? And why is it that AI, which is now for the first time after many decades of prediction of how it will change the world, actually changing the world and still is not showing up in the productivity statistics? So I think at the very least, we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're living in this era of AI competition between the United States and China and very explosive innovation, why isn't it improving material standards around the world? So the point of the book, as you mentioned, is not to predict a future where progress ends, it's rather to make the point that technological progress is not inevitable. If it was, the first industrial revolution would have happened a bit earlier in human history. If it was, most countries around the world would be rich and prosperous today.
So let's go back, though, and ask the question, what is progress anyways? I mean, what does that actually mean? And just to put that into context, here in Scotland during the Scottish Enlightenment, I'm sitting here in Adam Smith's last home, they were concerned and interested in progress, of course, but specifically in improvement of standard of living, improvement of the arts, improvement of knowledge, improvement of science. Is there a difference between progress and improvement? So perhaps you could define in your words what you mean by progress. Is it just a simple economic statistic, or is it something else? And perhaps we can come back to improvement, which I think is a broader, more expansive understanding of human progress, as it were.
Well, it's a great question. And to be clear, in the book, I mean technological progress, right? And so it's not a book that discusses human flourishing more broadly. But technological progress, I would argue, is absolutely essential to that, right? So if it wasn't for technological change, our societies would be no better off than they were before the first industrial revolution. People would essentially live on subsistence. If we hadn't had technological change, we wouldn't have just seen this rise in incomes. Much of the improvements in the quality of life that we had, whether it's antibiotics or vaccines, that is not captured in the productivity statistics. Neither are things like air conditioning, which we know can be important on a hot day. And so, more broadly speaking, just take the correlation between incomes per capita and subjective well-being. It's around 0.8, right? So the correlation is pretty strong. It's not 1, but it's very strong. So material standards is an important part of at least what we perceive to be important for our own life satisfaction. Now, some people may argue that the first industrial revolution was bad for progress because it meant that people, rather than working from their own homes at their own pace, surrounded by their families, began to cluster in factory town, where they spread disease, where their morals have been subjected to influences that were not seen as virtuous in the communities that they originated from. And so, I'm very open to the fact that there is more to human progress than economic progress and technological change, and people can have different views on what that constitutes human flourishing. I don't talk much about that in the book, but I do think that technological change is fundamental to the improvements in the material standards that we have. And, people vote with their feet every day where they want to live, and they're moving generally to more prosperous places rather than to poorer places.
So, just so I and listeners understand the key argument of your book, it's not that we're living in a moment where we've reached peak progress. It's more of that we are progressing or there's technological change, but that's actually not leading to better well-being and more wealth and income. Is that the essential argument of what you're saying?
Well, I think it's leading to more well-being and more wealth and income, but not at the rate of improvement that we saw during the middle of the 20th century. And so It's under-delivering, and we cannot take it for granted. And so the period in human history where we've seen rapid technological change has been a very short span, but, collective memory is not that long. And so I think we almost come and take this for granted. And you hear this very often in the tech community. Progress is unstoppable. Well, it's not. It's been halted in many places in the world, and they would even not have to invent all of these technologies. They could just adopt modern technology as it becomes available. And yet it's not happening. And so, it's essentially a pushback against the narrative that progress is inevitable and is something that we can take for granted. And it also sort of points out that no society has actually been a technology leader for very long, whether it was Song China, whether it was the Dutch Republic, whether it was Victorian Britain. And, maybe we shouldn't take for granted that the United States will remain technology leader forever either, although, it's hard to see who the contestants might be today. Some think it's China. I presume we will get to that later in our conversation.
Yes, you have foreshadowed the geoeconomic or geopolitical questions that I wanted to ask. But before we get there, I want to zero in on the idea of the inevitability of progress and the technological change. I think it's partly because we've been fed this diet from Silicon Valley that if we just take Moore's law, right, and we look at chips, right, in that field, there has been continued progress in the terms of the number of transistors you can put on a silicon wafer, right? They've been doing that, and they seem to be continually making advances. And so that gives you the perception, well, if it works in this specific niche product or technology, shouldn't it apply to everything? And your argument is actually, like, if we look broadly, because I don't assume that you're saying that we aren't making advances in some areas technologically, but in aggregate, you're saying that we're not progressing technologically at the pace that certain people would say we are. And this has consequences for how we understand and how we live through technological change.
Yeah, so two things can be true at the same time. We can have exponential improvements in technology, and Moore's law is exponential improvements in technology, but not exponential improvements in standards of living at the same time, right? So exponential technological change doesn't mean exponential economic change. And even with Moore's law, it takes about 17 times as many researchers today to produce Moore's law as it did back in the 1970s. And so even there, we're powering Moore's law with more inputs. Now, I'll be the first to admit that, the progress in AI over the past couple of years have been extraordinary, right? And it's been extraordinary in many other fields too. But, if you'd told me a couple of years ago that, we would have AI that is, PhD level in many domains, that is a better tutor than maybe everybody but some few of the foremost experts in that particular field, that we would have that, I would have thought that the world is very different from what it actually is now.
So I just want to emphasize to listeners that the video and the audio here Carl and I are real human beings. This is not AI generated conversation. No, but in all seriousness, I do want to talk about AI, but you mentioned, and I think this is interesting because I've been having a lot of conversations and we've been doing some work here at Panmure House in the area of antimicrobial resistance and issues of innovation in antimicrobial, so antibiotics and vaccines, which you mentioned. And I think it's one of these fascinating fields where AMR, antimicrobial resistance, kills lots of people, which, the solution to it for the most part is good hygiene and hospitals that are clean, right? So you can solve a lot of the problem through governance issues and management and equity in terms of access and the like. It's not an issue of, we need new antibiotics, because a lot of the workhorse ones are still powerful. They're not resistant in some ways, but they are resistance being that it's coming out. And I've been talking to some clinicians and people in this field, both also as investors, and it's interesting to understand to look at how we've made massive progress because of antibiotics and antivirals and the like. But now we're reaching a peak. And there's this debate around it where, on the one hand, as an investable field for R&D, it's actually quite difficult to make the economic case for it. But I think that's something, and many think that's something you can solve through various policies to make it attractive from an investment perspective or a public procurement, public policy perspective. But I was having an interesting conversation with somebody at the AMR Action Fund, which is a VC focused on new drug development, investing in biotech firms that are creating new antibiotics, antivirals, and the like. And what was fascinating about the conversation is I was told that there's a debate going on whereas some think if we just throw more money at it or it's an issue, then we'll solve the problem. But she was saying, actually, if you look, but there's also concern that we've reached a peak in the science. We've reached a peak in terms of what is actually possible in terms of producing new types of antibiotics and antivirals. I mean, I know we've made lots of progress, but there's a certain sense that actually the science is kind of reached a peak, and it's not a question of just throwing more money at it, which I think is important for both investors, private and for public authorities, where it's not just simply a matter of throwing more money at it. Actually, there's a function of the science is maybe limited. Now, some may say, okay, AI and new discoveries will happen through that, but I thought that was an interesting point that we forget often in these debates about technology, whereas I think, in Silicon Valley, it's just, we need more CapEx, we need more, just throw lots more money at more engineers and we'll lead to it. But what you just mentioned, which I think applies also to what I said about antibiotics and antivirals, what you said with the silicon or for chips, is that 17 engineers are more necessary to create the same kind of benefits to get to Moore's law than they were in the 1970s. So I think this debate between, it's not just a money issue or monetary. It's actually there's an issue with the science, and there's an issue with the kind of the limits of technological progress.
Yeah, I think that's a important observation. And to be clear, I do think funding matters. I do think resources matter.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also clear that it's not the only thing that matters. And a key question is, are the bottlenecks that we're seeing, are they sort of inherent in science and discovery itself, or are they institutional? Ben Jones, for example, has this concept of the burden of knowledge, making the point that, it takes longer to train a scientist these days because to be up to speed on the existing literature and state of research, it just takes longer time. Against that, you might hold, though, that people still actually produce the most innovative research earlier in their careers. So I'm not sure if that is the key constraint. I observe, for example, that Europe or the European Union as a whole spends as much on public R&D as the United States, but the United States gets a lot more out of it. I observe in the book that the Soviet Union employed more scientists than the United States at peak, but they got less out of those inputs. And so I think the system, the market system, or the way we organize discovery has a real impact on our ability to convert those inputs into more valuable outputs. And so, the more barriers we throw up, the harder we make it for scientists to actually do the research that they want to do rather than spending time on ticking boxes on grant applications or doing other things that might further their careers in various ways, but not scientific discovery. That is a problem. It's also potentially a problem if we allocate R&D funding to the wrong places. And so in Europe in particular, through Horizon 2020, a lot of funding goes to large consortium, which have to satisfy a lot of people in different disciplines. And, the idea itself might be a good one, but, people tend to want to focus on the research they want to focus on. And so they will do everything they can to tick the boxes, but then go back to do what they actually wanted to do. And, you might be better off rather than, a huge group of people coming together to fund a few individuals, which are more likely to have a disruptive idea. And that's what we see in the research as well. Solo inventors, scientists tend to produce more foundational discoveries than these larger teams.
I don't want to go off on Horizon Europe or Horizon 2020, but I've been part of some of these consortium grant applications. I've been on part of a cost project. And, so much of the driving force behind that is political more than it is about scientific discovery. It's about, well, we need to integrate and we need to involve people from across Europe, which is a great idea in and of itself about creating mobility and the like. The emphasis on these large teams, and even for individual researchers, the emphasis on team science, as we would call it, I think it's detrimental. I mean, particularly for the social sciences and humanities, this idea that we all need to have massive teams, when actually it's, why can't we just go back writing books by ourselves or doing projects with a few people and keep it small? But no, it has to be part of these bigger collaborations. Now, I don't want to go down that route and have us be too wonky academic here on our industry. I do want to come back to some of the differences between Europe, US, and China. But before we do so, I'd like to discuss artificial intelligence a bit more, because that's what is on everyone's mind. What will AI do? Because it has become quite powerful. Maybe I've not put the right prompts in. I still think it's not quite at PhD level. I know for certain, coding and the like, it's quite effective. I'm impressed at the quality that some of these are doing, and it's getting better. But I find it's contingent on what you tell it to do, and it's a nice formatting tool for me if I need it, or I've used it for read this email and can you make it more diplomatic so I don't sound so angry? And it functions in that way nicely. But what I'm worried about from a deeper perspective is that, just take the craft of writing, right? So you've just published a book, and I think when we met in Riyadh last year and we were talking about your book, and I don't want to scare people, but it's over 100,000 words, 150,000 words, and took you 5 years to write. This is something that to me sounds, it's painful, right? You spend lots of time writing and rewriting and crafting an argument, and that's part of the discovery. I mean, even though you're an economic historian, right? There's still a bit of discovery and development of ideas. And as you know, I mean, just writing a paper, there's a bit of trial and error, and you learn, how to do it. My concern is when you take young people, or even is how do they miss out on a lot of these key kind of development aspects of learning. And it's not saying that everyone's going to be publishing books with leading, publishers, or writing much for that matter in their careers, but it's still that the point of suffering, if you like, through the process of learning how to write and develop an argument. And AI is taking that skill development away. And some would say it's taking away because learning how to write, and we're not all going to be, great poets, but even still that progress, that learning how to craft an argument is part of learning how to think. And if AI does that for you, then we lose something. And then will it slow progress rather than speed it up? And I can think of other examples of what it will take away from us.
So there's a lot in there to unpack. So first of all, I agree that AI is not the PhD level across the board, but in some things it's beyond PhD level, and in some things it's not, right? So if you want to, a good answer to why did, Argentina do very well economically in the early 19th century, uh, only to have a century of stagnation? That's not necessarily in my field of expertise, but I know a little bit about it. And AI can certainly give a better structured, more comprehensive answer to that question on the go than I could. And so when it comes to tutoring, when it comes to drawing upon the body of knowledge that we have accumulated, just structuring that and throwing that back at you, I think it's better than basically any human apart from a few in their sort of expert domains. But it's definitely not as good when it comes to generating new knowledge and generating new ideas, and that's also part of doing a PhD. And so, if the world was just a static distribution of events, you could, have AI, brute force, general artificial intelligence, right? But it's not, right? The world is changing all the time. You have to deal with novel events. You have to respond to them on the go. And when it comes to pushing the frontiers of technology and innovation, well, there's no way that you would get to, well, if you take the arts, for example, there's no way that you would get to conceptual art by training an algorithm on expressionist paintings, right? Or if you would have asked an LLM back in 1900, will humans ever be able to fly? It would have looked back at the long list of failed trials. It might have looked to birds as evidence of flight being possible in principle. But even there, it would have concluded that there's no bird that weighs more than 30 pounds that is able to get off the ground. Larger birds like ostriches don't fly. And so, by all likelihood, it would have concluded that human flight is not possible, then obviously it would have been wrong. And so in that domain, I still think that there is some way to go with AI. And I do worry, as you said, that AI might actually make human innovation not harder, but it might undermine the way we learn and our capacity to innovate in the future. And so you and I, we write papers, books, articles, and we know that the only reason that we are hopefully able to have an informed conversation about these things is that we have written about them, and that has allowed us to structure our ideas. And when students today use AI to write essays, they are missing out on the learning process. The output might be as good as what they would have otherwise produced, might even be better, but they are not acquiring knowledge to the same degree. And that means that human capacity to innovate might go down as a consequence of that. I think it's also true that since the computer revolution, we have seen a striking increase in the number of inventive outputs measured by number of papers being produced, number by patents being produced. We haven't seen the same striking upsurge in high quality publications, breakthrough publications, and breakthrough patents. So there's an emerging gap between production and actual progress. And that is striking to me because it's hard to think of technologies that should have aided science and innovation more than the personal computer and the internet, right? It allows us to connect the best talent around the world. It enabled people to have the world's stored knowledge in their pockets and almost instant access to everything that's out there. And now with AI also, we have better tools for screening and finding that knowledge easily. But, we still seem unable to innovate in more impactful ways. And I think it comes back to sort of what we choose to do with the productivity gains that we see, right? So, we can either use AI just to produce more outputs and do more projects and drill more holes, or we can try to use it to drill deeper. And it seems to me that since at least the 1990s, and probably earlier, we have used technology more to do more rather than going for few projects but more impactful. And
So
that's probably something to do with the incentive
yeah.
structures that we've put in place. And I think unless we change those, there's no technology that is going to reverse the innovation challenge that we currently face.
So in short, there's much more quantity, but the quality is just not improving much.
Yeah, and
And
you can see why. The
yeah,
more projects you're on,
yeah,
the more you're scratching the surface, the
yeah,
more you overextend yourself. And if you're lucky, if you invest your entire life into one thing, you might be remembered for that. If you're lucky, you're never going to be remembered for 10 things,
no.
or even two. And so we are incentivizing people, I think, to pursue too many things at the same time, and I think that's part of the innovation challenge.
I mean, I think from the sector we're in, universities, there's certainly the publisher parish, in the UK, and the research excellence framework, which is you have to produce lots of papers, and then for promotions, and the incentive structure is skewed towards outputs, and then there's games around those outputs and epistemic communities, as it were, that gatekeep who's got a good paper or not. And half the time it's like, why is this a good paper? Why is this a top journal? Oh, because a group of people got together and said it is. But I mean, I remember being part of a hiring committee and looking at CVs for a business school, and I was shocked that none of the cover letters were actually able to say, none of the people applying were able to articulate the one thing that they did. And their CVs were this, numbers and stars, and look how many great things that I'm doing. But then I could not find a single sentence. What is it actually that you're interested in that you do? And why does it matter? It was all, I've published in this top journal and that top journal, and I'm on this, and that, and the other. And it was sad, actually. You think, really? What's the point? Why? What is this all this output for? And I don't think this is even exclusive to the academic world. I mean, I think there's incentives in society generally to, take the production of apps coming out of Silicon Valley, right? I mean, obviously it's easy to have a software company where you come up with an app because there's not much capital expenditure that's needed, but it's, all these young, bright minds are coming up with the next stupid app to do what? Make it easier for me to, not go to the store and buy my food in a normal way that I'd get extra benefits from. I don't know, I can't come up with a good example, but just, I'm producing this, that. It's like, what's the point? Where it's not, you don't feel like there's progress, right? Technologically, but that gets back to the question I had at the beginning about improvement and, human flourishing. And I know your book isn't focused on human flourishing and improvement, though I think there's probably extensions, as you mentioned, that technology actually makes this life better in many, many, many ways, and that's quite important. But if I think back to the Scots during the Scottish Enlightenment, it wasn't simply just material improvement. It was also improvement of the mind, improvement. I don't want to sound spiritual, but it was in a moment when they were shunning religion and looking for something else, but there was still that spiritual improvement, that spiritual kind of underpinning, that moral, what makes us human and what makes us better, and what is art, what is music, because all these matter, right? It's not just the pecuniary gains that are important. This is where I worry that AI is great. It's going to do amazing stuff for us. It's fantastic that, we have supercomputers now effectively in our pockets and apps that make life easier in many ways. But there's that improvement that is perhaps missing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But just to sort of go back briefly to our discussion around what, progress in science. And so I don't want to be too dismissive of the work that people do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in our
Me
field,
neither, right? Me neither.
in our field, economics, it's one of the exceptions to what I said earlier, in the sense that it's not just about producing more output, it's all about getting into a handful of journals. And the research that's being published there is excellent. The quality is very high, but it comes at the cost of, steadily reducing the scope of the questions that are being asked, right? Because we're asking our students to produce, very precise answers to very precise questions, and there is no room for trying to answer the question, how would China have developed absent Hong Kong? Because there's no experiment you can run for that. And so, unfortunately, we are discouraging people to think about the bigger questions, including the one that you mentioned around improvement. Now, I'm not sure that economists are best placed to answer the question of what constitutes a fulfilled life, and I'm certainly not best placed to answer that question by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to dodge that one.
Yeah.
But other than to say that I do agree that there are many other things that constitute a fulfilled life. If we ever get to the stage where AI does everything, including frontier science, which is possible, I'm not going to dismiss that possibility. Many people ask themselves, well, in such a world, what am I going to do with my time? Because in our societies, our status, our sense of self, very closely tied to our work, right? It didn't always used to be like that, right? Before the Industrial Revolution, people worked, but they didn't have jobs in the modern sense. Most people, plowed the fields, and there was not that much in terms of distinguishing you from your fellow farmer in terms of just the work that you did. And so if you could think back to your high school class before everybody were in work and define themselves by what they did in the labor market, were the things that people cared about then more or less virtuous than what people care about in your surroundings now? My sense is unfortunately not, but people did care about other things, and humans are tremendously adaptable. And there's no doubt in my mind that would be tremendously disruptive if we moved into a post-work world, but we would find meaningful things to do. There's still more people playing chess professionally than when Deep Blue beats Kasparov back in the 90s. We're still happy to compete in that domain. We will find other domains to compete and enjoy ourselves in.
I agree. I'm a techno optimist in many ways and believe that humans are adaptable and societies are adaptable, and it's not just dire. And yes, there's disruption, but that disruption is a political problem, right? I think it's a political problem to be solved. I'm not giving an easy solution, but I think there's ways of getting around some of these disruptions, and I agree that we will find ways to entertain ourselves. Now, I want to move on from AI to round up our discussion around the geopolitics, or if you like, the geoeconomic competition that we're seeing, where technological progress is at the forefront of it in many ways. What the United States is doing vis-a-vis China, and the arguments for it are put down as economics or national security, but I'm more of the mind that it's all about technological leadership, and the U.S. wants to retain its technological leadership in a world where China is not simply a recipient and hyperscaler of technological developments. We're seeing China becoming innovative domestically, which is becoming more globally competitive across various industries. How do you see that tension? How does that play out in your book? How do you view the world we're in geopolitically?
So, a point I'm trying to make in the book that the United States has been there before, right? So, in the 50s and 60s, anxiety surrounded the Soviet Union and Sputnik, and Soviet building a stronger military industrial complex. And in the 1980s, it was Japan that was about to overtake the United States. People worried that what had already happened in autos with Toyota outcompeting General Motors and Ford was happening in semiconductors, and indeed the semiconductor production shifted quite decisively towards Japan at the time. And so, the worries that currently exist around China are by no means new. The question is China a more formidable peer competitor or not? And if so, what should we actually learn from the Chinese system And what can we actually learn from previous episodes? For example, why didn't Japan end up overtaking the United States? Now, the case I make in the book is that a key reason why Japan didn't overtake the United States is that their institutions were geared towards technological catch-up. So in the 19th century, Japan had developed more sort of statist, corporatist institutions to catch up to Britain. There was close collaboration between the government and the emerging Zaibatsu conglomerates. In the post-war era, those Zaibatsus were transformed into Keiretsu, but sort of the same model more or less applied. And, that worked quite well in terms of exploiting and scaling up and process improvement in existing technological fields, and it encouraged scale, but it didn't encourage dynamism. And so Japan completely misses the transition from hardware to software. And in the United States, that transition happened entirely through new companies, not existing conglomerates. And that's really what, makes America stand out vis-a-vis the rest of the industrialized world, with the exception of China, because basically every firm was state-owned up until their opening. So naturally, Chinese firms are relatively young. But if you take the 5 largest companies in the United States by market cap, they're all in technology. They are 30 to 40 years old on average. If you do the same exercise, you look at Germany, France, Italy, Britain, Spain. It varies a bit, but they're mostly over a century old. In Germany, there are firms that go back to the second industrial revolution, like Siemens. An exception is SAP, which was founded by 5 former IBM employees back in the 70s. If you look at France, they're all in luxury goods. So this dynamism is very much an American story. And, when monopoly power became a concern in US history, often the state actually acted to open up markets, right? So the breakup of AT&T, for example, I think was absolutely critical to the development of the internet. So when the National Science Foundation released ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet, to the world, there was no state company that could essentially internalize the technology and bottleneck it inside one boardroom if it saw no immediate profit from it. And so the breakup of AT&T, I think, was critical to the organic development of the internet in the United States. Another thing that the United States did to undermine Japan's process technology advantage was global integration with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, with China. And that actually undercut Japanese producers. So it was by embracing globalization in large part that the United States won against Japan. And so, I think those 2 lessons do apply just as well when we look to competition with today, rather than bringing back production to the United States, where labor costs and construction costs are just much, much higher. The United States should seek to diversify global supply chains to other places. And, a key reason why China is still behind in semiconductor is that it's not integrated into a global supply chain the same way that the United States is. And more broadly, China is a dynamic country. There's no questions about that. But, even if you take some of the most inventive firms like DeepSeek, they build their model off Meta's Llama. They certainly did noteworthy improvements, and that firm was permitted to fly under the radar because it served national objectives. But, a key feature of the Chinese system is that because of the absence of the rule of law, is that as a firm, you have to build strong political connections. You have to take resources that you could have otherwise invested in innovation to build up political capital. And you need to stay close to the authorities, but of course, when priorities switch, and you might become a victim of that. And so there's no inherent benefit to the Chinese system, rather the opposite. In fact, one key driver of Chinese innovation, though, has been that there's a lot of talent.
Mhm.
And some of that talent came back from the United States and from Hong Kong and from Taiwan and other places. And China has a relatively decentralized system in the sense that you have this major economy with local governments and provincial governments competing for better jobs within the party system. And the way that you get promoted is by performing well economically in your region. And so that protects firms in those places from the grabbing hand of government, if you like. And in the technology fields where China is most competitive, like EVs, for example, competition is fierce. So China, I think, if anything, underlines the fact that a lot of the technological progress that we've seen, whether it's in the United States and or in China, comes from competition and dynamism more than anything else.
Right, I'm glad you said that, because I think what I find troubling is the rhetoric in the West that presumes if we're going to compete with China, particularly the sectors that it's dynamic and competitive in, EVs, green technologies, other industries, that we require more state capital. I mean, Donald Trump is buying parts of Intel. The Europeans have no problem subsidizing their industries, and then they prefer it. And often it's this sense of, well, we have to compete with China, to keep up with the Chinese, we must become more state capitalist. And that's not to say that there's a longer conversation about the inherent neo-mercantilism that is all economies. If you're looking for a classically liberal economy, that doesn't exist. But in any case, what you said, and I like to emphasize that, is that in industries where China is competitive globally, it's because they're intensely competitive in China. They are dynamic. It's market-driven competition. That's not to say that the state hasn't been involved, but everywhere there's state involvement. It's part of the game. There's regulations and subsidies and all kinds of procurement rules that governments of all stripes, even the most liberal, use to advance their own industries. And China's no different. And certainly in some cases, it does a lot. But in the industries that it seems to matter now, it's in part because it's driven by ingenuity of entrepreneurs, a massive talent pool, and just cutthroat competition. And that, to me, says that, well, we're not going to compete with China by becoming more state capitalist, by investing and buying Intel or bailing out Northvolt in Sweden. It's by embracing more market dynamism and actually reverting to the market dynamics that drove technological development in the West, or particularly in the United States, rather than pulling back. And likewise, pulling back on globally integrated supply chains and global integration, or in short, globalization.
Yeah, but to be clear, and I agree with all of that, to be clear, China is doing industrial policy, but it's doing it in a way, mostly, not always, but mostly, that is pro-competitive. So it has regional governments with their pet companies competing against each other, and then some, completely private foreign invested firms competing with those as well. And it's mostly the foreign invested, the private firms, that are most successful in China as well. Now, if the US, for example, wanted to replicate the Chinese model, it would not take a stake in Intel. It would try to get every state in the United States to see their own semiconductor company to compete with Intel, right? That would be more like the Chinese approach. And, China is not taking golden shares in ByteDance and Tencent and these companies because it thinks that it will improve their dynamism. It's doing that because it wants to have some political leverage and control over these companies. And I don't know what the rationale of the Trump administration is, whether it thinks that that deal is going to revive Intel, or it just wants more political control over that company. But, if they wanted to get the semiconductor industry back on its feet, they would try to revive competition rather than propping up a dying national champion. More broadly, what has produced American technological dynamism over the centuries? Well, the key ingredient has clearly been immigration, right? There's the most undisputable factor in all of this, yet, the government is clamping down on immigration. Another part has been America's decentralized system of universities. ARPA would not have been a success without it. ARPANET, which came to be the modern internet, would not have been seeded without it. And yet, the United States is clamping down on its universities. It's also cutting the funding for which scholars are competing, and is increasingly shielding them from foreign competition through tariffs, and increasingly also from domestic competition by taking shares in various state enterprises. So the United States is currently taking the worst from the Chinese model, implementing it, and from what I can tell, doing everything it can to undermine its own technological dynamic.
Carl Benedikt Frey, your new book, How Progress Ends. I think we'll end on that note, that America trying to become more Chinese, but taking the worst of the Chinese model, not the ones that are making it dynamic. So we need to return to those liberal principles that made the West, the United States, successful. Carl, thank you for being on the New Enlightenment, and hope to see you again soon.
It's been a pleasure, Adam. Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment Podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.